We'll get started. I am Tamar. I use she, her pronouns. I am the community organizer at Cascade and Washington Bikes. Welcome everybody to the Washington Bike Walk Roll Summit. We're really excited to have you all here for this 4-day virtual event. We're really thrilled, like I said, to see people from around the state and beyond. We'd like to get started today with a land acknowledgement. The summit is virtual and participants are clearly joining from many lands. Cascade Bike Club and Washington Bikes are two statewide organizations, and we acknowledge the land that our offices are on as the traditional home of the Duwamish, Tulalip, Muckleshoot, and Suquamish tribal nations. Without these communities, we wouldn't have access to this environment, and we want to take the opportunity to thank the original caretakers of the land who are still here. And if you don't know what lands you are on today, you can look in the chat in just a moment, and there's a website that will help you find out your place on the land. We'd also like to note that we are recording this session, and the recording will be available following the summit. So get started here. The summit, as many of you know, is hosted by Cascade Bicycle Club and Washington Bikes, two sister statewide organizations with a shared vision of safe and healthy future where bicycles bring people together, eliminate inequity, and create thriving communities. Cascade serves bike riders of all ages and abilities throughout the state, educating new riders, advocating for safe places to ride, and hosting really fabulous rides and events around the state. Washington Bikes advocates for bicyclists' rights, endorses political candidates, holds officials accountable, and works to shape policies that will make bicycling safe and accessible for all. I'd also like to take a moment to thank our sponsors, Washington State Department of Transportation, Columbia Bank, and Darrow. These collective contributions have helped us bring together 14 panels with expert and excellent speakers, and with registration free for all attendees. I'm now quickly going to introduce today's session and then pass it over to our awesome panelists. You're here for Bending the Curve, Comprehensive Planning to Reduce Sprawl. Our panelists are Chris Comeau at City of Bellingham, Colin Quinnhurst at City of Spokane, and Kirk Rappy at Snohomish County Government. We're going to be talking about the question, why does it take a longer time and more effort to walk or bike to destinations in our cities? This session will explain the rules that have created our sprawling cities, how longer distance influence our choices to walk, roll, bike, or drive, and present examples of Washington cities that are making development regulation changes to reduce foot miles or wheel miles traveled. And a panel of urban planners from Bellingham and Spokane will discuss what changes they have made and how you can also get involved in your community's comprehensive planning process. And finally, we have this time for introduction. I'm going to pass it along to our great panelists for their presentation, and we'll reserve some time at the end of the session for Q&A. So as they're going through their presentations, please feel free to ask questions in the chat bar. We'll be collecting those questions and then sharing them back out to answer at the end of the session. We'll also be providing a feedback form for this and all of today's sessions in the chat as well. So please share your thoughts with us at the end of today's presentation. With that, I'm going to stop sharing, pass things off to Kirk. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Kirk Rappy. I'm with Snohomish County. Before that, City of Linwood. Let me get my slides up here quick. Share my screen. Full screen. So I'm joined again by Chris Comeau with City of Bellingham and Colin Quinnhurst with the City of Spokane. We put this session together to discuss how local plans and development regulations can have a big influence on whether people decide to bike, walk, or roll, or take transit to their destinations. I did notice real briefly, I noticed a lot of people from state and local government. So some of this, my intro stuff might be old hat to you, but it's really broad for everyone who's at the session. So I'm going to quickly briefly summarize Washington's planning framework. The Growth Management Act, or GMA, is the state level legislation that requires counties and the cities within them to plan, coordinate on planning, and to develop comprehensive plans that have different elements in them that include housing, land use and transportation, among others. This map shows the current deadlines for finishing the upcoming updates for comprehensive plans. If you live in the blue and green counties, your city or county should be starting to prepare workshops and outreach on the comprehensive plan, and we encourage you to get involved in that process. This is kind of a top-down look at Washington's planning framework. I want to focus in on the red triangle. This is the local level where cities develop their comprehensive plans, which are the goals and objectives for the city for the next 20 years. And those influence updating or changing or creating new zoning and development regulations. And those in turn are required by to be followed by private developers, and that's how they design their projects. So if these are put together well, you can have good development that makes it easy to walk and bike to destinations, or not. So this is a list of some of the local development regulations that are what create sort of the feel and the way a cityscape is designed. If you look at the image on the right, this is actually a place in Washington State. I won't say where, but you can see the influence of things like minimum parking requirements. You've got a mall in the lower right corner that has a lot of parking because there's no cap, minimum parking requirements. Single-use zones where you've got single-family housing and other types of housing that are off by themselves. And then you've got street standards and a lack of connectivity. So you can imagine it would be difficult to get from the north side of this map to the south side by bike or walking. And that is partially a large result of development regulations. And that's what the other two panelists are going to talk about, what their cities have done and what they've done to change some of this in Bellingham and Spokane. So I'm going to introduce Chris Como first. He's our first presenter. For the past 21 years, Chris has created Bellingham's transportation plans, policies, and programs. Chris has served on the Washington State Active Transportation Safety Advisory Council, and he has served the American Planning Association Washington chapter in various roles, including president of the Northwest section. And he's also served as a Washington representative to the National APA's Transportation Planning Division. In 2022, Chris was inducted or elected to the American Institute of Certified Planners College of Fellows, FAICP. Colin Quinnhurst is our second speaker, and he is an associate planner for the city of Spokane and a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners. His work focuses on projects that improve safety, comfort for people walking, bicycling, and accessing transit. He currently manages bicycle planning and shared mobility programs, transit-oriented development programs for the city of Spokane. Previously, Colin worked for the city of Spokane Valley and the Salt Lake City Transportation Division, where he worked on the city's first downtown protected bike lane network. Colin also conducted transportation demand management and bicycle education programs for commute options for Central Oregon. So I'll now hand it off to Chris Como to start his presentation.
Thank you, Kirk. I'm going to throw my slides up here. Somebody just give me an indication when you can see them. Are those visible?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'll put them in presentation mode here. And off we go. Okay, so what I'm going to focus on, first of all, thank you very much, Cascade, for inviting us to present here. It's wonderful to be part of the summit. And I'm going to share with you what we've been doing in Bellingham for quite a long time. And basically, we've been integrating land use and transportation for a very long time. And one of the key messages I would like everybody to take away from this is that this doesn't happen overnight. It's got to be done intentionally and purposely, and you've got to be committed to sticking with it and fighting battles and keeping things going. So for those not familiar with Bellingham, we're between Seattle and Vancouver, a little bit closer to Vancouver. We're approximately 100,000 residents. We're a college town, and Bellingham is essentially a place that draws people who are really interested in active outdoor lifestyles. Since 1980, Bellingham's population has doubled. And in our last comprehensive plan, the 20-year forecast was looking to accommodate 36,000 new residents. From the land use side of things, for a very long time, we've been focused on infill development instead of greenfield urban sprawl out at the edges of the city, trying to build up rather than out. And that's led us to adopt what we call here urban villages. That's modeled after Seattle's use of the term urban villages, but they're compact, high density, mixed use areas where it's easy to walk, bike, and take transit. On the transportation side of things, we decided to adopt some aspirational transportation mode shift goals in our comprehensive plan. That was after a multi-agency trip to Boulder back in the early 2000s. I'll talk more about that. We've been engaging in true multimodal transportation planning, all modes for all people. We'll talk more about that. And I just mentioned, we're focused on people, not just vehicles. That's a really key message here, and we'll certainly get into that. And everybody here is familiar with the term complete streets. We've taken it beyond just the street, and we're looking at complete networks here in Bellingham. We'll talk more about that as well. As I mentioned at the beginning, it's been a long process. It takes a long time to get some of these things in place. So, don't get dissuaded if things don't go right the first time. You got to keep at it. So starting in the early 2000s, we saw what was going on with the National Complete Streets movement. We essentially incorporated the principles of complete streets into everything that we were doing. We did not adopt the label at that time. We simply did it. And there's a big difference there. And we worked with our transit agency. We're not a transit provider, but we work hand in glove with Whatcom Transportation Authority here in Whatcom County. And they went with us to Boulder. And after we all came back, Boulder's got the hop, skip, and the jump branded transit lines. WTA came back and basically flipped their business model to focus on ridership rather than coverage. And you're going to hear more about that. At the same time, and just shortly after that, we began creating some master plans for these urban villages. And they're these areas where we've got more complete sidewalks, more complete bikeways, and they're all connected with these new transit lines you're going to hear about. And really key, I mentioned that our comprehensive plan was designed to try to accommodate 36,000 new residents over the 20 years. 30% of that growth is supposed to be accommodated in these urban village areas. So here's where they are around Bellingham, and the green line here on the graphic on the right shows you the transit lines that connect all of those. And as I mentioned, they're branded similar to the ones in Boulder, Colorado. We've got blue, green, gold, and plum. We used to have the red line. It's no longer a 15-minute headway, it's a 20-minute headway. So I still kind of consider it a high frequency line. But these connect all of our urban villages, making it that much easier for people to get around. And the cool thing about this is because they're branded, you can just show up at any of these bus stops knowing that a bus is going to show up in either direction every 15 minutes. So you don't really have to have a schedule. I mentioned the transportation mode shift goals that we had adopted in our comprehensive plan, and that's what these look like in the upper right. Just as an example, with bicycle mode share, we, according to the census, we're at about 3.9% or have been, and the census has been pretty messed up with COVID. But our aspirational mode shift goal is to get to 12% bicycle mode share. Now, that's based on what the League of American Bicyclists considered the baseline for their platinum level bicycle friendly communities, just as an example. Can we achieve that? It's hard to say, but we're certainly aimed at that. So that's why these are considered aspirational. That's where we're trying to go. And so when we get into transportation plans and programs and development regulations, that's what they're all aimed at. We're trying to make this mode shift. To that point, back in the mid-2000s, growth management requires cities to not only adopt level of service standards in their comprehensive plans, but you're required to adopt ordinances that monitor and enforce these level of service standards over time. The state doesn't tell you how to do it. They simply tell you you have to do it, and you have to show them how you're doing it. A lot of areas have simply defaulted to what is considered level of service standards in the highway capacity manual. I refer to those as vehicular level of service. And we certainly were looking at doing that, recognizing that there were problems with it, but we were not able to dissuade our council from going down that path at that time. We adopted our first concurrency ordinance, and you'll see more about this in a few minutes. We were a little dissatisfied with that. So we developed here in Bellingham some measures that are based on person trips, not vehicle trips. And I'll talk extensively about that. I can't go into as much detail as I'd like to here. I've got about 12 minutes, but if you want to know more, down at the bottom of this page, everything in blue text here is links to things on our city web page. So you can find more information at these links. But this was the big game changer for us, adopting a multimodal transportation concurrency system here in Bellingham. Basically what it boils down to, Kirk was talking about the Growth Management Act, and what the Growth Management Act tells cities is what they should be focusing on is doing compact urban infill, discouraging sprawl, encouraging multimodal transportation planning, trying to maximize benefit and minimize cost. A lot of places, as I mentioned, they defer to these vehicular levels of service that are in this national manual, the Highway Capacity Manual. The problem is those levels of service and the methodology is not registered to local characteristics, land use or transportation, doesn't resonate with what's happening on the ground in each community. So typically, jurisdictions adopt these levels of service, and then traffic studies get performed. And of course, traffic studies are heavily focused on vehicle impacts. So the mitigation always tends to be focused on vehicle capacity mitigation. Unfortunately, that results in a lot of road intersection widening, and it results in sprawl over time. So basically it comes down to, a lot of the methodology that's been adopted is not really geared towards achieving what the GMA actually is asking cities to do. And of course, that can be equated with Albert Einstein's famous attributed quote, insanity, doing the same thing over and over again, but expecting different results. And I just want to say, with the graphic over here in the lower right corner, I have great respect for engineers. And so I would add a qualifier here, and I would say that this is how most engineers have viewed transportation for quite a long time. I think that is changing, but you can see that it's really favoring the automobile here. And of course, if you adopt these kinds of levels of service and use this methodology, it's going to lead you down a path to a logical conclusion. And unfortunately, this is what it looks like. Nobody would ever, I think, desire to see this in their communities, but this is what has actually happened in real places over time. So here in Bellingham, we just said, this just isn't going to help us accomplish our infill goals and try to prevent urban sprawl. Obviously, we need to come up with some new methodology. Nothing actually existed at the time. There was no such thing as multimodal level of service. That didn't come out until the 2010 Highway Capacity Manual. So we had to invent all of these performance measures. We hired consultants, and they helped us look at 15 different alternatives. We landed on what we refer to as a plan-based concurrency system, which allowed us to take a giant step back and say, hey, what are we really trying to accomplish here? The Growth Management Act quite literally says that the transportation element is supposed to implement your land use element. So if we're trying to do that, we need to integrate land use with our transportation. And the way that we did that is that we carved our city up into these 20 little mobility sheds. You can see there's the urban villages. We've even got urban institutional, which is, it's not an urban village, but it's for the campuses that we have here, like Western Washington University, Whatcom Community College, and St. Joseph's Regional Hospital. So those are kind of very distinct places that have different characteristics affecting them. And then outside of the urban villages and the institutions, we've got these transition areas. And on the outer edge of the city, much more auto-oriented than the core of this city, we've got these suburban areas. In addition to that, we said, okay, well, in order to support all the non-motorized transportation planning that we're doing, we need a dedicated funding source. We took advantage of the state law that allows a jurisdiction to create a transportation benefit district, and thankfully that was passed by the voters. I will just say that that allowed us to create our current pedestrian bicycle plans. It was renewed in 2020 with 82% voter approval. So clearly people were happy with the way things turned out over that 10-year period. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. We created economic incentives for the urban villages where we were recognizing that less vehicle trip making was happening in these areas. Therefore, we were going to reward developers for taking the financial risk by reducing their transportation impact fees and focusing on these areas. If that's where we want the growth, we should be incentivizing that. So that's what that program's about. In addition to that, we specifically created primary pedestrian and bicycle networks here in town. And this just kind of shows you what those look like. The project lists are extensive for these plans, over 400 in the PED plan and over 200 in the bike plan. In our 2016 comp plan update, we folded all of these into the transportation element, and we took our complete streets focus even further and created what we call a complete networks program. And it wraps in the mode shift goals in our concurrency program. And we also then report each year on what's happening. This is what that looks like. And again, you can see that what we're really striving for here is balancing everything. We're absolutely focused on vulnerable users, trying to emphasize safety for people walking, biking, and using transit. But we also have to recognize that the transportation system serves all modes. And so we're trying to rebalance the system to not exclusively favor automobiles, but to really balance it so that there's space and facilities for all users. As I mentioned, we report on this annually. Here's just a glimpse of what that looks like. You can go look at the report yourself if you're interested with that link. But we tell everybody each year, hey, here's where we're at. This is our progress report. We can show you what we've been able to do with the money that you've been willing to give us. Furthermore, we've been, again, continuing to work with our transit agency. They've just created a long-range transit plan. We've created an ADA transition plan here in Bellingham that we're now folding into our pedestrian and bicycle master plan updates that we're doing this year and next year. And we're also just engaging with WTA in a high-frequency transit study, which we hope will lead to supporting some more policy toward transit-oriented development. There's more work to be done there, but hopefully this will really help what we're going to be doing in our comp plan update. On the land use side of things, just so everybody can see how all of this has played out, I am happy to report that we have exceeded our goals for infill, and according to our buildable lands report, we've achieved 160% of what our comp plan set out to do. So that's fantastic. That means that we can actually accommodate an extra 10,000 people above what the comp plan envisioned. Part of that has come through all the things I've showed you, updates to regulations, our subdivision ordinance, looking at ADUs, an infill toolkit that we've got adopted here in Bellingham, lots more multifamily development, these urban villages. We've done a ton of lane removal with road diets and removing vehicle capacity, which has actually allowed us to gain density while supporting non-motorized transportation. And we're hoping that all of this work is going to extend into our comp plan update and allow us to go even further. On the transportation side of things, we've been able to accomplish quite a lot with our ped and bike planning, implementing a lot of these projects. And further to the point, because we baked social equity criteria right into these plans, we've been able to make a lot of these investments in low-income neighborhoods, which is really, really important. As I mentioned, we're updating the pedestrian plan right now. Next year, we'll be diving into the bicycle master plan. We've been able to do tons of projects. I mentioned road diets. We've done 11 miles worth of road diet here in Bellingham, and we've removed parking, over 6 miles of on-street parking to install bike lanes. And Monday night, I am going to be in front of City Council talking about the potential for removing up to another 4 miles in the next couple of years. We have proudly been awarded Gold Bicycle Friendly Community by the League of American Bicyclists, that's just fantastic. We're very proud of that here in Bellingham, and we're updating our bike master plan next year. This just shows you some of the progress that we've been able to make over the last 10 years. You can see the bike ped improvements on the left, and on the right is different funding sources. This is the investments in low-income neighborhoods. And here's just showing you that, again, we're very proud to be one of only 2 gold bicycle friendly communities in Washington and one of only 34 in the entire US. It's a big deal for us. This is showing you some actual images of some of our urban villages. This is the Samish urban village. All of these buildings have been erected in the last 3 years. There's a building here, this building here in the middle, and this building here, accommodating hundreds of new residents. There's 2 more very large buildings on the north part of this corridor. This is an affordable housing complex for 150 residents. This will be 200 apartments for primarily probably college students. Then in the Fountain Urban Village area, these are some other buildings that have gone up. And here's what it looks like on the corridor. So again, we've had tremendous success with the urban village model from both a land use and a transportation planning standpoint. And I'll be happy to answer any questions when we get into the Q&A session. Now, I'd like to hand it over to Colin.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. That's going to be a tough presentation to follow. A lot to learn from Bellingham. Bring up my slides here, and thank you, Cascade, for having us as part of this group. Oh, I've been talking to myself this whole time. All right, thank you, Chris, for having us. And thank you for that great presentation. That's gonna be a tough one to follow. Thank you, Cascade, for having us. My name is Colin Quinnhurst. I'm from the city of Spokane in Eastern Washington, pretty close to the border of Idaho. And so coming from the opposite side of the state here, and talking about how we can align our comprehensive plan land use with walking, biking, and rolling. So starting out, I just want to start with what our pedestrian and bicycle master plans say as far as our vision goes for what we're trying to achieve. And as Chris mentioned, both our pedestrian and bicycle master plans are baked into our comprehensive plan. And so they're adopted as appendixes to the transportation chapter. But what we're trying to achieve is barrier-free mobility for all populations in terms of walking, and making riding a bicycle an integral part of daily life for people of all ages and abilities across Spokane. And as far as goals go for what we achieve, we want to quadruple our bicycle ridership over our comprehensive plan horizon, which is 2036, and triple our commute mode share to 2.1%. So both of those are trying to get to where Bellingham is currently and complete our 220-mile network. We're about halfway there in our current network, and if we stay on pace of about 7 miles per year, we will achieve that goal by 2036. So that's where we're trying to go. This is where we are. We're at about 0.7% as far as mode share for bicycling. And this is a pretty common situation. We have a great local grid of neighborhood streets that are slow, pretty comfortable to bike on, but a lot of heavy duty arterial crossings that aren't pleasant to play Frogger on. But where we could be is that up to 60% of trips today in the US are less than 6 miles. We know that 49% of trips in the US are less than 3 miles, which is the perfect range to walk and bike if there's a safe facility there. So how do we approach capturing some of these trips? There's the facility plans that are in our bike and pedestrian master plans, expanding the sidewalk network, expanding the bike lane network, but there's also the underlying fabric of our land use, which is really the focus of a lot of our comprehensive plan. So what does our comprehensive plan say as far as land use and achieving our active transportation goals? It says a few things, and real quick, this graphic shows that it is possible to capture that 49% of trips where safe facilities are present. This is the Dutch national travel data, and it shows that in that 1 to 3 mile range, when safe facilities are present, you can get into that 40 to 50% range of trips being accomplished by bicycle. So as I mentioned, our comp plan does talk about how we integrate land use and transportation. We have a few policies and goals. One goal is to coordinate our land use and transportation to result in an efficient pattern of development that supports alternative transportation modes consistent with the transportation chapter. Of course, walking, biking are the original transportation modes and the main modes of travel. So alternative transportation might be a little outdated there. But we want to make significant progress toward reducing sprawl, traffic congestion, and air pollution through that coordination. Specifically, we want land uses that support active transportation, that provide a compatible mix of housing and commercial uses that support short trips that you can walk and bike. And then this was recently amended into our comprehensive plan goals for land use 2 years ago, and that is to encourage transit-supported development that includes a mix of employment, residential, and commercial uses adjacent to high-performance transit stops. And comprehensive plans are required to define how we're going to accommodate our population growth. And for the past 20 years, Spokane's approach has said that we are going to accommodate population growth through a centers and corridors strategy. On this map, you can see our centers and corridors outlined in those kind of dashed circles and dashed oblong ovals. That's where our population growth is slated to go. All the purple is single family residential currently. And that at the time was not expected to change. Also on this map in the light blue lines and purple lines is the high performance transit network planned by the Spokane Transit Authority. And you can see that these two go hand in hand. The STA has planned their high performance transit network of BRT, high frequency premium transit service to align with those centers and corridors. So our current plan in those single family residential areas follows traditional zoning practices for the past 100 years that is focused on really separating uses and protecting single family residential zones for detached single family homes, which has created some challenges for getting around the city and making those short trips to neighborhood destinations. So our traditional form of zoning in the US really focuses on breaking out residential, industrial, commercial into their own separate categories. But going back to how we developed, around the turn of the century and how European zoning is still done. And there's a great video that's linked on this slide that helps explain this. But going back to the original patterns that were built around walking and biking really reduces the number of zones and expands the flexibility within each of those zones. So for example, within a single family residential zone, you might see something like this old school German village where it's like 3-4 stories with commercial on the bottom. So residential could include, even though it's identified as residential, could include duplexes, fourplexes, sixplexes, small shops, small industry even. and then as well as a few exclusively residential areas. So that's the way we're going back to in a lot of US cities, which Bellingham has accomplished through their infill toolkit. And currently, Spokane is going back to that as well in some interim zoning ordinances, and where we're looking to go with our next update to the comprehensive plan in 2026. So what you see in this photo is a pretty common development type in many of Spokane's most beloved neighborhoods, which is what looks from the outside, as far as the building envelope goes, like a traditional single-family residential home, but really accommodates 2 units, 4 units, 6 units, and bumps up that density in these areas. And we're looking at going back to that. Our traditional zoning around that time also included neighborhood markets and corner stores, and we're seeing those corners and those existing buildings being redeveloped back into those coffee shops and neighborhood destinations. So right now we have an interim zoning ordinance that was allowed under state law and is exempt from legal challenges right now. And it expands our residential zone to include that single family residential blob that you saw, that purple blob, expands the options in those areas throughout the city up to 4plexes. So it's giving people options to create more density in those zones. And that's called the Building Opportunity and Choices for All initiative. But within the centers and corridors too, we realized that there's a big opportunity to double down on those with that high performance transit. And so we have a series of transit-oriented development studies going on right now that look at these areas, that align those areas targeted for growth with transit, and what can we do to make those, to get the most out of those areas. So it really modeled these out in terms of what we can accomplish in terms of housing, where we have a mix of uses allowed, and creating multiple blocks with amenities, and going up a little bit higher, going from, instead of 2 to 3 stories, looking at 3, 4, 5 stories, and providing a mix of affordable and mixed income developments. And so part of that is really 2 simple changes that are the focus of encouraging more development in these areas. One is to reduce the parking requirements. Right now we have a lot of parking requirements that are making it not quite pencil out to do these denser housing developments. We have a limit on height, but a high parking requirement. And so you end up having to build structured parking for a pretty short building, and it ends up being too expensive. And so in these TOD studies, what we're finding is that we need to bump up the building height slightly and reduce the parking requirements significantly to make these developments pencil out. And then rezoning these areas to allow that type of use. But along with that, it's not just changing the land use types. I think, as someone mentioned in the chat, a 20-minute bike ride, it means you need 4 to 5 miles of high quality bike infrastructure to make that bike ride worthwhile. And that's also what we saw in that Dutch travel data, is that there are a lot of trips in that 1 to 3 mile range, but you have to provide the safe infrastructure in order to accommodate those trips and shift those to walking and biking. So with these TOD studies, what we're doing is going into a really fine-grained look at our walk and bike networks around those transit station areas, and going beyond our bike plan and our pedestrian plan to create a fine-grained network of access routes to those stations. So protected bike lanes, buffered bike lanes, neighborhood greenways, pathways that get you directly to those high-frequency transit stations from the broader bike network. And with that, as those recommendations come forward, we're amending the bike plan map in our comprehensive plan to include those new recommendations. And these are the types of facilities that are being recommended in these studies for those bus rapid transit routes. So instead of just the standard striped bike lane, we're looking at ways to protect those bike lanes and starting to build those too. This is our first protected bike lane going in downtown along our first bus rapid transit line. It's called the City Line, right through the heart of downtown. And this is our first attempt at a protected bike lane that should be open by the end of this year. And then with plans for many more of these types of projects. So this is in Northeast Spokane. And if future projects are really emphasizing more of these neighborhoods that need more support. And that's supported through the statewide and federal grant programs too, that are increasingly emphasizing putting these facilities in places that have traditionally been underserved. And so this is Illinois Avenue in Northeast Spokane. And then this is the Greenway intersection improvement in West Central Spokane. And these are the types of facilities we're looking at throughout the network to accommodate all those short trips. And so that's what I have to present. I just wanted to touch on a couple things real quick that Chris talked about as far as concurrency goes. And we have those policies here as well, and we're required to monitor our bike network development each year to ensure that we're making progress on that network. And the other piece I wanted to point out is that there is an annual comprehensive plan amendment process that people can get involved in. And over the past 3 years, we've amended our bicycle plan every year, doing about a dozen amendments each year to kind of incrementally bring up the quality of the recommendations and put those in places where these studies are recommending better facilities. And so this has been kind of an annual window to incrementally improve these routes. And it's opportunity, like an automatic opportunity for public feedback on how we can improve our plan, though we are due for a full scale upgrade of that plan. So with that, I'll wrap it up there, and thank you for having us as part of this.
Okay, I think maybe if Chris can join us as well. We have a little time now for some questions, and I see that there's a bunch in the chat. There's a question for Chris. Have you looked at economic development and tax revenue metrics and how the performance of your urban village strategy compares to an auto-oriented suburban style development pattern?
Well, there's a lot there. I will say that I could show, I don't have it at my fingertips, but we could certainly show that there's been a lot more residential units produced in the urban villages than the outer ring of the city, the subdivisions that are happening for detached single family. I would say that over the years, we've certainly seen our sales tax receipts surge in the more dense parts of the city. That's where all the activity is happening. And we're certainly, favoring the urban villages as well as schools and transit as the main criteria in our pedestrian and bicycle master planning. So it's all leading into these areas. People are able to get there. In terms of economic metrics, again, I don't have any at my fingertips, but I know that, for instance, our urban village transportation impact fee reduction program that I showed, that's been extremely successful. We've also made use of the multifamily tax exemption for residential units in the urban village areas. So there's a lot there. I'd be happy to follow up on that with you after the conference.
Okay, great. So this one's for Colin. Can you address decision-making in limited right-of-way corridors? By way of example, having to choose one bike lane on one side of the road or a shared use pathway on one side and no sidewalk on the other.
Sure, yeah. I think that's kind of the constant challenge of how to get in the best facility type, is how you make the most out of that right away. I would say that one piece of guidance that's been really helpful is the Federal Highway Administration's guidance on road diets, because they provide these thresholds for where road diets are just a great fit. So, or lane repurposing, however you want to describe it, but essentially repurposing lanes from vehicle traffic to walking and biking. And it has some thresholds that they're higher than you'd normally expect. And up to 10,000 is a great fit for repurposing travel lanes. As far as the specific question about, a shared use path on one side of the street versus a two-way bike lane, traditionally we've done a lot of shared use pathways as improvements. But what we found is that as bike volumes increase, it's become more and more challenging for everybody in those shared environments. And so we're starting to separate the bikes out wherever possible and provide a protected bike facility is the plan going forward wherever possible. And a specific example of how we're going back and forth on this, and I'll try to keep this short, is we have one major 3-lane roadway through downtown Spokane, Washington, and 3 to 4 lanes, one direction that has like 9,000 cars per day, which is way under the threshold for repurposing that lane. But we still struggle with concerns about congestion or intersection function. But I think the knowledge and the desire has shifted where in this recent batch of comp plan amendments to the bike plan, we just went forward and we're proposing a bike lane on that street, recognizing that it will require a lane repurposing. And there's support from top to bottom from Plan Commission and City Council to take that approach. So hope that answers your question.
Okay. Another question for Chris, and you may have answered this in your presentation, but is the mode share you referenced in your presentation based on commute trips or all trips?
That's a fantastic question. We use the American Community Survey. It's from the census, and that is commute oriented, journey to work data. I will say that obviously that's not all trips. However, it is the standardized data that's available. It's also the data that League of American Bicyclists use to compare different cities around the country. So clearly it's not capturing the entire picture. I will also say, however, that throughout the decades, we've become really, really great at counting cars, and we're just not very good at counting bikes and people walking. And I wish we were. I wish I had a really easy way to go out and collect all the data and some way to quantify the number of people walking and biking, but it just doesn't exist at this point. You could invest in all sorts of counters. They're not always reliable. So honestly, until we're able to collect more data, we're kind of stuck with the sources that are out there.
Okay, another question for Chris. Do you have recommendations on how a similar sized city could position themselves well to receive external funding for bicycle and pedestrian facilities?
Well, I will say that having the dedicated local funding through originally the Transportation Benefit District, which is now rebranded as the Transportation Fund, it allows us to leverage that local funding for additional outside grant funding. And we've been really successful at both the state and federal level getting grant money in the city of Bellingham. The graphic I showed with the networks growing over time kind of shows the different funding sources. So it's really important to try, in my opinion, to integrate the land use side of things with the transportation. A grant agency wants to hear a compelling story, and they want to be supporting infrastructure that's moving more people rather than less, and obviously focused on safety. So, when you can tell that story about, hey, here's where all the people are living, and these are the places that they want to go, they're happy to help you, with state and federal grant money. And again, we've been very successful here. I'd be happy to talk to anybody about that offline after the conference.
Okay, next question is for Colin. Does Spokane have development or design standards for multifamily in the single family zone? For example, are there minimum lot sizes?
Yes, there's a new batch of design standards associated with that interim ordinance. I think we took away minimum lot sizes, recognizing that was a big limitation. The other thing we did was reduce parking requirements and increase bike parking requirements. I think I saw that in the chat too. That all kind of goes together.
Okay. there's a question about House Bill 1099, a bill to update the Growth Management Act to ensure Washington cities and counties are planning for climate resilient communities. It did not pass in 2022, but it's clearly important that we plan for climate change. How do you recommend that folks embed climate planning and the tenets of HB 1099 into comprehensive planning?
I'll take a quick stab at that, and then I'll hand it over to Colin. So Bellingham has a climate action plan. We have had one for quite some time. It was updated in 2018. And we're taking all sorts of different actions in terms of the land use transportation component. I mentioned, the focus on infill, but from the transportation side of things, we're electrifying our entire fleets. We're putting in electric charging stations all over town. We're actually funding WTA's electrification of their transit bus fleet, putting in rapid chargers at their bus stations. Again, we work hand in glove with them. We're supporting their efforts. They're supporting our efforts. We're trying to make sure that all new development also has the underground infrastructure for electric chargers. So all multifamily residential projects have to include a certain number of charging locations. It goes on, and I'll stop there and hand it over to Colin.
Yeah, and I'll put a link to this in the chat, but our city council adopted a sustainability action plan that specifies some goals around that, and just a laundry list, a library of actions that we can undertake. It wasn't adopted through the administration though, so I think it's still an ongoing conversation, but a lot of the planning actions that we're taking right now around housing and transportation are in direct alignment with that sustainability action plan and those climate goals. But it's an interesting political discussion.
Okay, next question is for both of you again. Thank you both for sharing, great work. What resonates most to create support for these policy changes with your elected leaders? How much do you try to copy something known or craft a local solution?
That's a really good question. I don't know that there's an easy answer. I will say my personal philosophy is if there's something out there that's working, you should steal it. Planners are pirates, and you should take what works and leave the rest and go back to your jurisdiction with the tools that you need to get the job done. I will say, like I mentioned at the beginning, for us, I think it's just been a concerted effort over a long period of time, and looking around at what other places are doing and borrowing and stealing and trying to figure out how to, in some cases, making up brand new tools that didn't exist to try to accomplish what your plans have as goals. And it's really important that every community take a really strong stand on wanting to protect its individual character. You don't want to be everywhere USA. So I'm very grateful that the Growth Management Act doesn't dictate top down to cities exactly how to do things and lay out the methodology. Everybody should follow their own recipe for what their own community wants to be over time. I'll stop there and hand it over to Colin.
Yeah, I 100% agree that all public projects are in the public domain, and we can beg, borrow, and steal. And there are hundreds of cities now doing these types of bike lane projects, and so definitely we aren't trying to reinvent the wheel. But I would say that having a local story has been really powerful in the land use changes. Having the story about Spokane being a streetcar city whose largest period of growth was from 1900 to 1910, before the automobile dominated. And that's when our mixed use neighborhoods developed. And having that story about those are our favorite neighborhoods. And that was a pretty good strategy. And it made Spokane what it is, and saying that we're just trying to reuse those same tools again. And that's been a really powerful story. It's been a Spokane specific story. And I think having that thing that people can hold on to and relate to about their city is important.
So it looks like we got a few minutes left. So there's a sort of a short question for Colin. Any bike parking requirements along with car parking in multifamily?
Yes. So it's a modest increase right now. We were at 5% of car parking, requiring bike parking. We bumped that up to 10% with the interim zoning changes. But right now we're drafting a major upgrade to our bike parking ordinance that would go beyond that and do it based on land use type. So, institutional versus residential would all have different categories, which we don't currently have. A lot of cities do though. So I hope that answers your question. And that's an example of outright stealing from places like Davis, California, just going and looking at their table of bike parking per land use type.
Okay, and the last question, and I might add a little bit into this one because I've obviously been a land use planner at a couple cities, but we can all answer it. What is the best way for community members and advocates to get involved in comprehensive planning processes? I will start out by saying that, contact your local city planning department, call the city, find out, go on the web and see what they've got going on. You can usually get on a email list for upcoming workshops and things like that. And I'd also say more broadly, I think a lot of residents, I've worked for smaller cities, 35,000 people or less, but I think a lot of people in cities don't realize how much political influence they can have, even more than staff, on things. And, there's, for example, in Edmonds, there's the Edmonds Bicycle Advocacy Group. They work with their transportation planner and talk to them about their interests and concerns. And, I've been to a lot of council meetings before COVID where nobody's there. And, unlike other levels of government, I think you can have a lot more influence that way. But with the comprehensive planning process, yeah, just reach out to your local jurisdiction, your local city, and see how you can get involved.
Yeah, I guess I'll just tag on and say that, we're always offering opportunities for people to engage. We can't make people care. We can't make people come to meetings, but we certainly offer the opportunity. And I will say that COVID has actually taught us a lot of important new lessons in terms of how we go about doing that, reaching people in new and different places, meeting people where they're at, instead of expecting them to march down to City Hall and have a meeting in the middle of the night when they'd rather be with their families. And so, we're trying to take advantage of all the new technology that's out there. We've got public engagement platforms and many different ways of reaching out and getting together with people. But it's an evolution over time. And I think, new things will come along and we'll move away from things that we used to do, and it will just continue. But ultimately, it is quite literally, like it says, public participation. People need to choose to be involved as well.
Real quick, every comment makes a big difference. We just experienced that with our bike plan amendments. A neighborhood group decided they wanted a proposed bike lane extended by 5 blocks, and they got a bunch of people in their neighborhood to submit comments, and we made the change. So every comment makes a big difference.
I'm going to jump in. It's great to hear that. That's, as a community advocate and as an organizer, it's good to hear that our voices are appreciated and needed in this conversation. And I want to thank the three of you for being here, and for everyone on the other side of the screen for listening in, asking those questions, participating. Really appreciate all of your time and your expertise. And as we wrap up, I just want to let folks know that our next session will be at 3:30. It's going to be Safer Speeds on Our Streets, Creating Transportation Systems for Humans Who Sometimes Make Mistakes. We'll be joined by folks from Washington State's Department of Transportation, Seattle's DOT, as well as the city of Port Townsend. And you'll see in the chat, Wendy just dropped in a feedback form. Please share your thoughts on today's sessions. And I see a comment from Phil in the chat as well. If the panelists wouldn't mind putting your info in the chat so that folks can follow up with you. As we saw, comprehensive planning is happening. It's happening around the entire state. And I'm sure that we'll need to have conversations like these moving forward to make sure that we all have the information that we need to be creating more just, more resilient, more equitable cities. Comprehensive planning is a great way to do that. So again, thank you all. Hope to see many of you at 3:30, and have a great rest of your day.
Goodbye, everybody.